Welcome back, CSC230, to part 2 of ex8 Jumbotron responsive. And what we're going to do is make another media query for the columns of our layout that we were working on. So we already did a media query that changed our navigation in our top part to go there, and that's exactly what we want. And now we want these columns to become stacked. And we're going to use something called flex direction column to do that, except we're doing it at a different breakpoint. And to do that, we could just copy this. We can copy just this top part and make sure that I add my second curly brace. So I'm just going to copy this, Command C, and I'll put an extra space and I'll paste it. Now this one is going to be the one that's 640. So I could type 640 here. That's just in my comment. The important part is here where I put in 640 because that's my breakpoint. And down here I see a little red wavy line. I should put my closing curly brace there. And now what I'm going to do, I'm not going to do anything with these. These are fine. We're going to go and look and see what we want to do with the columns. We don't have to do too much to them. We should just make them also be flex direction column. So we shouldn't have to do anything. Let's just see where that is. We'll go to our HTML, and that's going to be main flex. So we could say the flex inside of main. And what we'll do is just make the flex direction be column. And that should take it out of being on a single row the way they are right now. Because remember, they consider these, even though they're columns, I know that's what's confusing, they're kind of showing up in a single row. But now we're going to put them in individual columns stacked on each other. So what we're going to do is do the same thing we did in our first, is just make flex direction column and do gap 0. So I'll just copy this one. I'll highlight it, do Command C, and then in here I'll tab over and get rid of this extra space. And instead of nav flex, this one is going to be main flex. And we'll see if that works. And it's going to be flex direction column, and we'll leave gap 0 there just to take out any gap. And that should be all we need. So let's see what happens here. We'll refresh it, and I'll move it over. And around 800, the nav menu goes underneath. And when we get to about 640, it's not doing anything. The problem is, do you know the problem? I know the problem. I see what it is. It's kind of with our syntax. If we go into our styles, what we did here is we had an element nav and then a class flex. Now, I went down here. Main is not an element. Main is a class. So if I'm using the class of main, I need the dot. Or else I could put section. If I did section, that would work. I could either do section because that's the element, or I could do main, it's the class. But if it's a class, it needs the dot in front of it. Now you might say, well, why did that work? Because I have both a class and an element nav. So if I had a dot there or without a dot, it doesn't matter. But here the dot matters because that's a class name. So the class name main is affecting the flex inside of that. So it's the flex class inside the main class. So I did not identify a class by putting the dot there. So that should be the problem. So let me make sure that is. I'll refresh this. Move this over. That should go first. And now you can see right about there, now it breaks. Now the problem we have is that we need space underneath these buttons. Or we need space above the columns, but if we put space above the column headings, we'd have extra space here. So we'd be better off just putting space underneath the buttons. So let's just do that. And we could even use two of them, you know, the first child and second child if we wanted to, if we didn't want to do it here, but we'll just do it below all three. We'll just target all the buttons. And we just have to find those buttons, and we can look in our CSS, find where those buttons are. Those are the column buttons. Here we go, button, column. And I should just be able to choose button column. I'll highlight this. Those are the buttons in the column. And I'll just put another declaration here, button column, and I'll put my closing curly brace. And all I'm going to do here is I'll use margin since I did that for the other one. I'll do margin bottom. And remember, margin is outside of it, so I don't want to do any kind of padding inside it. So I'm going to do margin bottom of the button columns. See if that helps. And I'll just put 2M for now. That might be too much, but at least we'll know it. So we're putting margin bottom, and let's see what happens when we get to 640. So we're going here. We're not worrying about the nav anymore. There it breaks. And I didn't refresh it. So there's refreshed, and that looks okay. I think that looks fine. 2M might be too much, but I think that's okay. And just to look at something here, if we had used padding instead of margin, if I put padding bottom and said, oh, I just want padding underneath the button, let's see what that would have done. I'll run, I'll go here, I'll refresh, and let's see what happens now. See if that makes it any different. And yes, it does. That's why I used margin, because remember, padding is inside the element, whereas margin is outside the element. So this is a good example of margin and padding. Padding is putting it inside there, and margin would go after it. So we want to make sure we use margin. That's why I used margin with the other one too. So just be careful, especially with elements like that have kind of an inner part of it. You want to use margin because margin will be outside of it. So I want to make sure that is margin. And again, I just hit this just to save it, even though I don't think you have to do that, but I always do that. So now it's going to be margin bottom 2M, and I'll go back here, refresh it. And if you think it needs to go sooner, you could certainly change that number. That looks fine, and these look fine. No matter how much you go, now they're all stacked very nice. Now, if you think that number is too much, you could make it 660 or something, or 680. Maybe you want it to happen sooner. You could put 680, just a little bit sooner. Maybe that'll help a little bit. Maybe it doesn't matter. I'll refresh it. Now those columns will change a little sooner. So they go from there. That's as thin as they get. Then they break to single columns. And this is all in one line here. Now, if this got any smaller, which it doesn't at this width with this particular browser, but another thing you could do, we do have a lot of space here. It's still at 80%. So if you didn't need that much at that small breakpoint, what could you do if you didn't want so much margin on the side? And where did that come from? Let's just look. Where did that come from? That came from, I think, that container. Remember our container was 80%, and then we had padding on the top and the bottom, TRBL. So we had padding on the top and bottom, and we had width of 80%. So what you could do, if you think you have too much margin there, and I think we do, I think this is too much margin when it gets at a small size. We don't need that much margin there. We can get a little closer. So what we could do, instead of 80%, this container, we can make it like 90% and see if that looks better. And that's just something I'm thinking about now. I didn't plan on doing that. So let's do that. Let's copy container, and we'll add it to this one only when it gets that small. And I'll tab that in, and I'll make sure I have my closing curly brace for container. And instead of with 80%, we'll make it with 90%. See if that helps. And if not, we'll make it 95 and see how that looks. So let's see what happens here. See if this helps a little bit at smaller sizes. So we don't have to do it when the navigation first breaks, but when this breaks to single columns, now it looks a little bit better. Now it's a little closer to the edge. We don't need all that margin. So that's a little better if you'd want to make it 95, but I think that looks good. I think that's perfect. So that's something else that helps. And in part 2 of the video, this is the media query that we did. So when it gets down to 680, the flex class inside of the main class is going to have a flex direction of column, which is going to remove the float, remove the side-by-side kind of row setup. We'll take away the gap just in case it affects anything. Button column, we're putting a margin bottom, so we put extra space underneath the buttons because when they were in columns, they got too close together from the button to the next paragraph heading. And then we changed our container width to 90% instead of 80%. And if you'd want to go and make it, 92, anything like that, I think would be fine. And that's it. So that's our second media query. And this was our first media query. So not a lot of stuff, but we had to do some problem solving here. And I kind of did it as we were working. I did not have this planned out. So I kind of worked through. So that's why sometimes things go wrong. But I want you to see some of those things going wrong because I want you to see my thought process as we're doing this and what I'm thinking about. Otherwise, it just seems all planned and it seems like I know exactly. But, targeting things like first child, targeting the container, putting space after the button column, making sure we're using margin and not padding. And when I practiced it, I made a new class. I made a nav flex class. But here we could just target the individual, the flex inside of main and the flex inside of nav. And just remember, when you're targeting a class name, it has to have a dot. And in this one, we didn't have a dot because I used the nav element, but I could have used a dot too because we have both. So it wouldn't really matter. If they both were like that and it was consistent, it shouldn't affect anything. Let me just make sure it doesn't as I'm telling you that. And it doesn't, so that's fine. So that's ex8 responsive, and we'll stop there. That'll be the exercise for ex8. Anything else we do with hamburger menus and Google Fonts and any of that, drop-down menus, we'll do as a different exercise. But that'll be ex8. So get that done, especially if you haven't done it. You have to do ex7 first. You have to get all the other Jumbotron stuff done first. But then that's all you have to do for ex8, and make sure that you look through the CSS responsive part from W3 Schools. A lot of good stuff in there. You could also check out Flex responsive. If you're confused about Flexbox, read about Flexbox as well. Learn as much as you can from it. I don't know if I can explain it as much as they can, and we did have that other video about that, but absorb as much as you can about Flexbox, absorb as much as you can about responsive. Read through this stuff too, because then we also have something called CSS Grid, which is something else other than Flexbox, which is another way of kind of breaking things up in rows and columns, and that's for a little more complex types of grids that you can use with CSS Grid. So we might tackle that at some point, but get this done first, and that's your ex8